At the family barbecue, my son-in-law Ryan stood up in front of 40 guests and announced that I was losing my marbles and needed to be looked after before she hurts herself. He said this while I sat 3 feet away, holding a perfectly coherent conversation with my neighbor about her grandson's college plans. The entire patio fell silent. My own daughter, Amy, just stared at her plate. 2 weeks later, Ryan received a FedEx package containing my Harvard Medical School diploma, my board certifications in internal medicine and geriatrics, and my latest bank statements showing 7 figures. He knows how to pronounce competent. Now, before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Dr. Margaret Thompson, though most people call me Maggie. I was 73 when this happened, and I had spent 45 years practicing internal medicine at Riverside General Hospital here in Ohio. For nearly 5 decades, I diagnosed illnesses that stumped younger doctors, managed complex cases that required both medical expertise and careful observation, and built a practice based on precision, patience, and an almost supernatural ability to remember details that others missed. There was something deeply satisfying about the methodical nature of medicine. Symptoms didn't lie if you knew how to read them. Lab results told stories that patients sometimes couldn't. Medical records created clear timelines that revealed patterns others overlooked. After retiring 3 years ago, I had settled into what I thought would be a peaceful routine in my modest ranch house on Maple Street, surrounded by oak trees, and the kind of neighbors who still brought casseroles when someone was sick. My days had found their own gentle rhythm. Morning walks around the neighborhood where I mentally cataloged the seasonal changes in everyone's gardens. Afternoons reading medical journals to keep my mind sharp. Evenings cooking elaborate meals just because I finally had time to follow. Recipes that required patience. It wasn't the adrenaline rush of emergency medicine, but it was mine. My daughter Amy lived 25 minutes away in Brookfield Heights with her husband Ryan. They had married 4 years ago in a ceremony that cost more than some people's houses, complete with ice sculptures and a string quartet. Ryan worked in pharmaceutical sales, which meant he knew just enough medical terminology to sound authoritative at dinner parties, but not enough to actually understand what he was talking about. He had the kind of confidence that comes from making good money, in a field where charm matters more than competence. What Ryan didn't know, and what I had never mentioned during their wedding planning or house hunting, was that I had quietly contributed $120,000 to their down payment. Not as a loan, but as a gift transferred, directly from my retirement accounts to their escrow company on a Tuesday morning in March. I had handled the transaction through my financial advisor, kept the paperwork in my personal files, and never expected anything in return. It was what mothers do, what grandmothers hope to do. I wanted them to have a solid foundation, literally and figuratively. What I also didn't mention was that my retirement portfolio, built carefully over decades of medical practice and conservative investments, contained enough money to buy their house outright 3 times over. I had learned early in my career that money, like medical knowledge, was most powerful when people underestimated how much you actually had. Amy and I had always maintained what I thought was a close relationship, though I noticed subtle changes after her marriage. Phone calls became shorter, visits more scheduled, conversations increasingly filtered through Ryan's opinions and preferences. He had strong views about everything from politics to proper dinner etiquette, and Amy seemed to absorb them like a sponge soaking up water. I tried to stay diplomatic, to avoid the kind of mother-in-law stereotypes that make family gatherings uncomfortable, but I watched my daughter slowly disappear into someone else's vision of who she should be. Ryan had a particular way of speaking to me that set my teeth on edge. He used the tone people reserve for elderly relatives they assume are slightly confused, speaking slowly and loudly as if volume could compensate for my supposedly diminishing cognitive abilities. When I mentioned current events, he would nod patronizingly and change the subject. When I offered medical advice based on 4 decades of experience, He would smile indulgently and suggest I might be remembering things differently than they really happened. The comments started small, little remarks about how I sometimes repeated stories, how I occasionally forgot names, how I seemed confused about things that were obvious to everyone else. These observations were always delivered with concern, wrapped in the language of love and worry, but they carried an undertone that made my stomach clench. Ryan had a gift for making criticism sound like care, for packaging dismissal as protection. The barbecue happened on a Sunday in late September, one of those perfect autumn days when the air smells like wood smoke and possibility. Amy had invited me to their annual end-of-summer party, a tradition Ryan had started to showcase their backyard and their social circle. I wore my favorite navy blue dress, the one with small pearl buttons that I had bought for Amy's graduation from college, and brought a homemade apple pie that had been my mother's recipe, perfected over years of Sunday dinners and holiday gatherings. Their backyard looked like something from a magazine spread. Professional landscaping, outdoor kitchen with stainless steel appliances, seating areas arranged to encourage conversation, and string lights that would create perfect ambiance once the sun went down. The guest list included Ryan's colleagues from the pharmaceutical company, several neighbors from their subdivision, and Amy's friends from her yoga studio. I recognized maybe 6 people out of 40, but I had spent enough years navigating hospital, politics, and medical conferences to feel comfortable in crowds of strangers. I found myself talking with Martha Stevens, a retired school principal who lived 2 houses down from Amy and Ryan. We discovered a shared interest in gardening and spent nearly an hour discussing her attempts to grow heirloom tomatoes and my success with late-season herbs. Martha was sharp, funny, and refreshingly direct about the challenges of aging in a culture that worships youth. We were deep in conversation about her grandson's decision to study engineering when Ryan approached our little corner of the patio. He had been drinking, not heavily, but enough to amplify his natural tendency toward grand gestures and unsolicited opinions. He was holding a beer in one hand and gesturing broadly with the other, the way people do when they want to make sure everyone is paying attention. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I should have recognized the signs. Should have known that the combination of alcohol and audience would bring out his worst impulses. But I was enjoying my conversation too much to notice the warning signals. Ryan inserted himself into our discussion with the kind of aggressive friendliness that immediately shifted the dynamic. He started explaining my own medical background to Martha, getting half the details wrong, speaking about my career as if it were something quaint and outdated. When Martha politely corrected him about a basic medical fact, Ryan laughed and said something about how older folks sometimes get confused about these modern developments. I felt my face flush, not with embarrassment, but with a slow burning irritation that started in my chest and radiated outward. I had spent my entire career dealing with condescending colleagues, patronizing administrators, and patients who assumed that being female meant being less competent. I had fought those battles quietly, professionally, with expertise and results that spoke louder than arguments. But this was different. This was family, and it was happening in front of strangers who didn't know my history or my capabilities. The conversation continued for a few more minutes, with Ryan making increasingly inappropriate comments about aging, memory, and the tendency of elderly people to live in the past. Martha kept glancing at me with raised eyebrows, clearly uncomfortable with the direction things were taking. Other guests began to notice the tension, conversations around us growing quieter as people tuned in to the drama unfolding in our corner of the patio. Then Ryan decided to make his announcement. He stood up, raised his beer bottle like he was about to make a toast, and waited for the crowd to quiet down. The string lights cast everything in a warm, golden glow. But I felt cold, suddenly as if someone had opened a door to winter. Amy was across the yard, arranging desserts on a buffet table, completely unaware of what was about to happen. Ryan's voice carried clearly across the patio as he began what sounded like a prepared speech about family responsibility and the importance of looking out for our loved ones as they age. He spoke about the difficult decisions that families sometimes have to make about the signs that indicate when someone might need additional support and supervision. He used phrases like concerning behaviors and safety considerations while gesturing in my direction with his beer bottle. The entire gathering had gone silent now, 40 pairs of eyes shifting between Ryan and me like spectators at a tennis match. I sat perfectly still, my hands folded in my lap, watching my son-in-law systematically dismantle my reputation in front of a crowd of people who barely knew me. He spoke about my increasing confusion, my tendency to repeat stories and forget details, my concerning lack of awareness about her own limitations. Then came the knockout punch, delivered with the kind of theatrical timing that suggested he had been planning this moment for weeks. Ryan looked directly at me, smiled with what I'm sure he thought was compassion, and announced to the entire gathering that I was clearly losing my marbles and needed to be looked after before she hurts herself or someone else. The silence that followed was deafening. 40 people holding drinks and dessert plates, frozen in place like actors who had forgotten their lines. Martha's mouth had fallen open slightly, her eyes wide with shock. Other guests stared at their shoes or suddenly became very interested in their food. Amy had finally looked up from the dessert table, her face pale with confusion and dawning horror. I remained seated, my back straight, my hands still folded. I had learned long ago that the most powerful response to public humiliation wasn't immediate retaliation, but quiet dignity. Let the moment hang in the air. Let people see exactly what had just happened. Let them draw their own conclusions about who had actually lost their mind at this particular gathering. Ryan seemed to realize that his grand gesture hadn't landed the way he expected. The crowd wasn't nodding in understanding or rushing to support his concerns about my mental state. Instead, people were looking uncomfortable, embarrassed, uncertain about how to respond to such a bizarre and inappropriate outburst. He tried to salvage the moment by launching into more details about my supposed cognitive decline, but his voice was getting louder and less coherent with each sentence. I stood up slowly, smoothed my dress, and picked up my purse from the table, beside my chair. I didn't speak. I didn't defend myself. I didn't create a scene that would give Ryan more ammunition for his campaign against my competence. I simply walked across the patio, through the sliding glass doors, through their house, and out the front door to my car. Behind me, I could hear the murmur of confused voices and Amy's sharp whisper calling my name, but I didn't turn around. As I drove home through the quiet streets of Riverside, I felt something shifting inside me, not with the dramatic intensity of a revelation, but with the steady certainty of a diagnosis finally confirmed. Ryan hadn't just embarrassed me tonight. He had shown me exactly what he thought of me, exactly how he saw my value within their family structure. This wasn't about concern for my welfare or genuine worry about my capabilities. This was about control, about positioning himself as the authority figure who got to decide when I was no longer competent enough to participate in my own life. The next morning, I woke early and made coffee in the kitchen that had witnessed 40 years of my medical career. Charts spread across the table during residency, research papers reviewed over breakfast before important presentations, phone calls from the hospital at 3 a.m. when a patient took a turn for the worse. This room had seen me become a doctor, had watched me solve medical mysteries that stumped entire departments, had been the quiet space where I prepared for surgeries that saved lives and reviewed cases that challenged everything I thought I knew about medicine. I opened the filing cabinet in my home office and pulled out a folder I hadn't touched in months. Inside were copies of my medical school transcripts, my board certification documents, my license renewals, and letters of commendation from hospital administrators and grateful patients. I spread them across my desk like evidence in a court case, each document a testament to decades of competence, expertise, and professional achievement. Next to my medical credentials, I placed my most recent financial statements. Investment portfolios that had grown steadily over 40 years of careful saving and conservative financial planning. Bank accounts that reflected the accumulation of a lifetime spent living below my means and investing wisely. Real estate holdings that included not just my house, but a small apartment building I had purchased years ago as a retirement investment. The numbers were substantial, the kind of financial security that came from decades of earning a doctor's salary and spending like a nurse. I had never shared these details with Amy or Ryan, not out of secrecy, but out of discretion. Money, like medical knowledge, was something that commanded different kinds of respect depending on who knew about it and how much you actually had. I had learned early in my career that being underestimated was often more useful than being accurately assessed. People revealed their true intentions when they thought you were less powerful than you actually were. But Ryan had made a strategic error last night. He had publicly questioned my mental competence in front of witnesses, had positioned himself as the concerned family member dealing with a declining relative, had essentially declared war on my cognitive abilities and professional reputation. What he didn't understand was that I had spent 45 years dealing with challenges that made his pharmaceutical sales job look like recreational activity. I had diagnosed diseases that other doctors missed, had performed procedures that required steady hands and sharper minds, had made life and death decisions while exhausted residents half my age struggled to stay awake. I spent the morning organizing my credentials into a comprehensive portfolio, the kind of documentation that left no room for interpretation or dispute. Medical school diploma from Harvard, magna cum laude. Residency completion certificates from Johns Hopkins. Board certifications in internal medicine and geriatrics, renewed every 10 years without exception. Continuing education credits that exceeded requirements by significant margins. Letters of recommendation from department chiefs, hospital administrators, and colleagues who respected my diagnostic abilities and clinical judgment. Next to the medical documents, I arranged my financial statements with the same methodical precision I had once used to organize patient charts, investment summaries showing steady growth over decades, bank statements reflecting substantial liquid assets, property deeds, and rental income records that demonstrated ongoing business acumen. I photocopied everything, organized it into a presentation folder, and sealed it in a FedEx envelope addressed to Ryan at his office. I didn't include a letter. I didn't provide explanations or defend my competence with words. The documents spoke for themselves, each page a quiet rebuttal to his public accusations about my declining mental state. This wasn't anger driving my response, it was precision. I wanted him to understand exactly who he had decided to publicly humiliate, exactly what credentials he had dismissed as irrelevant, exactly how much financial independence I possessed while he struggled to make mortgage payments on a house I had helped him buy. After I dropped the package at the FedEx office, I drove to Riverside General Hospital, where I had spent most of my adult life. I still had privileges there as a retired physician, still received invitations to medical conferences and professional development seminars. I walked through the familiar corridors, past the emergency department where I had worked countless overnight shifts, past the patient rooms where I had delivered difficult diagnoses with compassion and clarity. Dr. Patricia Rodriguez, the current chief of internal medicine and my former resident, happened to be reviewing charts at the nurses' station when I stopped by. We chatted for 20 minutes about recent cases, new treatment protocols, and changes in hospital administration. Patricia asked my opinion about a particularly complex diagnostic challenge involving an elderly patient with multiple comorbidities, and we spent another 15 minutes discussing differential diagnoses and treatment options. Our conversation was recorded in my memory with the same precision that had made me a successful physician for 4 decades. Every detail of the case, every nuance of the treatment plan, every consideration of potential complications. I wasn't losing my marbles. I wasn't experiencing cognitive decline. I was exactly the same sharp, analytically minded doctor I had always been, just operating outside the hospital walls instead of within them. That evening, I called my attorney, James Morrison, who had handled my financial planning and estate documents for the past 15 years. I explained the situation clearly and dispassionately, providing him with details about Ryan's public accusations and my response. James listened carefully, asked appropriate questions, and suggested we schedule a meeting to discuss my options for protecting both my reputation and my assets from any future challenges to my competence. I wasn't planning legal action, at least. Not yet, but I wanted my documentation in order, my financial affairs clearly structured, and my medical credentials properly preserved. If Ryan wanted to question my mental state, he would discover that I had anticipated that possibility and prepared accordingly. I had spent too many years watching families fight over inheritances and elderly relatives to be caught unprepared for challenges to my autonomy. The FedEx tracking notification confirmed delivery to Ryan's office the next morning at 10:37. I imagined him opening the envelope during his lunch break, expecting perhaps an angry letter or emotional response to his barbecue performance. Instead, he would find 45 years of medical achievements, financial independence that dwarfed his own net worth, and documentation of ongoing professional competence that made his pharmaceutical sales credentials look like participation ribbons. I didn't hear from Amy or Ryan for 3 days. No phone calls, no text messages, no visits to apologize for the public humiliation or explain Ryan's bizarre behavior at their party. The silence told me everything I needed to know about their assessment of the situation, about their willingness to acknowledge what had actually happened, about their capacity to recognize when they had made a serious miscalculation. On the 4th day, Amy finally called. Her voice was different, careful in a way that suggested coached conversation, words chosen to avoid further escalation rather than genuine communication. She asked how I was doing, mentioned that some of the party guests had reached out with concerns about the situation, and wondered if we could all sit down together to clear the air about what had happened. I agreed to meet, not because I expected apologies or acknowledgments, but because I wanted to establish new parameters for our relationship. I wanted them to understand that publicly questioning my mental competence had consequences, that dismissing my professional achievements was unacceptable, and that any future interactions would be conducted with appropriate respect for my autonomy and capabilities. We met at their house the following Sunday, the same backyard where Ryan had performed his theatrical diagnosis of my supposed cognitive decline. This time, there were no guests, no audience, no witnesses to whatever conversation was about to unfold. Amy had prepared coffee and arranged chairs around their patio table, as if we were about to conduct a business meeting rather than a family discussion. Ryan looked uncomfortable, not apologetic, but defensive, like someone who had been told he needed to participate in a conversation he didn't want to have. He avoided direct eye contact and kept checking his phone, as if expecting some urgent message that would rescue him from this awkward encounter. Amy sat between us, literally and figuratively, trying to moderate a situation that had moved far beyond simple family discord. I waited for them to speak first, to offer explanations, or apologies or at least acknowledgement of what had transpired at their party, but they seemed to be waiting for me to break the silence, to perhaps apologize for my response, or downplay the significance of Ryan's public accusations. We sat in uncomfortable quiet for several minutes, the kind of silence that grows heavier with each passing second. Finally, Amy cleared her throat and began what sounded like a prepared statement about family communication and the importance of understanding each other's perspectives. She spoke about how Ryan's concerns had been misunderstood and how my response had been somewhat disproportionate to the situation. She used therapeutic language, words like healing and moving forward, that suggested someone had been coaching her on conflict resolution. I listened without interrupting, noting the careful phrasing that avoided any direct acknowledgement of Ryan's behavior or any validation of my experience. When Amy finished her diplomatic summary, I placed a folder on the table between us. Inside were copies of the documents I had sent to Ryan, along with additional materials that demonstrated ongoing professional competence and financial independence. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't become emotional. I simply explained that questioning someone's mental competence in public was not a misunderstanding or a communication problem. It was a deliberate attack on their reputation and autonomy, and it required a proportionate response. I showed them my medical credentials, my continuing education certificates, my recent consultation with Dr. Rodriguez at the hospital, and my financial statements that demonstrated ongoing business acumen and decision-making capability. Ryan finally spoke, and his words revealed exactly how little he understood about what he had done or why his behavior was problematic. He suggested that I was overreacting to what he characterized as innocent concerns about my welfare. He claimed that his comments at the party had been taken out of context, that he had been trying to be helpful, that everyone knew he cared about my well-being and only wanted what was best for me. His explanation contained no acknowledgement of the public humiliation, no recognition of the inappropriateness of his amateur psychological assessment, no awareness that questioning someone's mental state without evidence or expertise was both cruel and potentially damaging. Instead, he positioned himself as the misunderstood victim of my defensive reaction to his legitimate concerns. I realized in that moment that Ryan would never understand what he had done wrong, because he fundamentally didn't see me as an autonomous adult deserving of basic respect. In his mind, I was an elderly relative whose opinions, feelings, and dignity were secondary to his assessment of my usefulness and compliance. He had appointed himself as the authority figure responsible for managing my decline, and my resistance to that role assignment was simply evidence of my inability to accept reality. The conversation continued for another hour, but nothing substantive changed. Amy tried to mediate between her husband's defensiveness and my insistence on accountability. Ryan alternated between justifying his behavior and suggesting that my response proved his point about my emotional instability. I maintained my composure throughout, speaking clearly and calmly about boundaries, respect, and the consequences of publicly attacking someone's competence without evidence. When we parted that afternoon, I understood that our relationship had fundamentally shifted. Not because of anger or resentment, but because I had finally seen clearly who they thought I was and how they planned to treat me as I aged. Ryan had shown me his vision of my future role in their family, and I had shown him documentation that contradicted his assumptions about my capabilities and resources. The dynamic had changed permanently, not through dramatic confrontation, but through quiet demonstration of strength they hadn't known I possessed. I wasn't their declining elderly relative in need of management and supervision. I was a retired physician with substantial financial independence, ongoing professional connections, and 45 years of experience making complex decisions under pressure. They would treat me with respect going forward, not because they had gained new appreciation for my wisdom or value, but because they had learned that underestimating me carried consequences they weren't prepared to handle. Sometimes respect born from wariness is more reliable than respect based on affection, especially when dealing with people who had already shown their willingness to sacrifice your dignity for their convenience. As I drove home that evening, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years, a deep sense of my own power, not the kind that comes from authority over others, but the kind that comes from knowing exactly who you are and having the documentation to prove it. Ryan had tried to rewrite my story, to cast me as a diminished character in his narrative about family responsibility and elder care. But I had written my own ending, one that honored 45 years of professional achievement and preserved my autonomy for whatever chapters remained ahead. The silence from Amy and Ryan stretched into October like a cold front settling over the neighborhood. No phone calls checking on my well-being, no invitations to family dinners, no casual text, messages about weekend plans. It was the kind of deliberate absence that speaks louder than words, a calculated withdrawal that felt both punishing and relieved. I had disrupted their narrative about my declining competence, and they were regrouping, trying to figure out how to proceed now that their assumptions had been so thoroughly challenged. During those quiet weeks, I began to piece together patterns I had been too polite or too hopeful to acknowledge before. Ryan's campaign against my mental competence hadn't started at the barbecue. It had been building gradually over months, maybe even years, through carefully planted seeds of doubt and subtle undermining that I had dismissed as personality quirks or communication styles. I remembered conversations where Ryan had corrected my recollections of events, insisting that I was misremembering details or confusing timelines. He had a particular talent for rewriting history in small increments, adjusting facts just enough to make me question my own memory without being obvious about his manipulation. When I mentioned books I had read or articles that had caught my attention, he would respond with gentle skepticism, suggesting that I might be mixing up information or remembering something different than what had actually been written. There had been incidents at family gatherings where Ryan would interrupt my conversations with younger relatives, explaining medical concepts to them as if I weren't sitting right there with 4 decades of clinical experience. He had a way of positioning himself as the informed authority while treating my expertise as outdated folklore, something quaint but ultimately irrelevant to modern understanding. I had tolerated these moments because I thought they reflected his insecurity, rather than a deliberate strategy to undermine my credibility. Now I understood that Ryan had been conducting a long-term campaign to establish himself as the family authority on my mental state. He had been laying groundwork for months, creating a narrative that would make his public diagnosis at the barbecue seem like the culmination of growing concerns rather than a sudden, inappropriate attack. He had been positioning himself as the reluctant but responsible family member who was brave enough to acknowledge what everyone else was too kind to mention. The realization didn't make me angry so much as it made me analytical. This was a problem that required the same systematic approach I had used to diagnose complex medical cases, examining symptoms, identifying patterns, and developing a treatment plan based on evidence rather than emotion. Ryan had made a strategic error by accelerating his timeline and going public before establishing sufficient credibility for his claims. He had overplayed his hand, revealing his intentions before securing his position. I spent those October mornings reviewing my own documentation with the meticulousness of a researcher preparing for peer review. My medical records, continuing education certificates, recent consultations with former colleagues, and ongoing professional activities painted a clear picture of sustained cognitive function and clinical competence. I had been maintaining professional connections not out of nostalgia, but out of genuine engagement with medical advances and case discussions that kept my mind sharp and current. Dr. Rodriguez had called twice since our hospital conversation, once to follow up on the complex case we had discussed, and once to invite me to a department conference on geriatric medicine scheduled for December. These interactions weren't courtesy calls to a retired colleague, but active professional consultations with someone whose expertise remained valuable and current. I documented these conversations carefully, noting dates, topics discussed, and the specific medical knowledge I had contributed to ongoing patient care decisions. My financial advisor, Kenneth Walsh, had scheduled our quarterly review for early November, and I decided to move that meeting up to late October. Kenneth had been managing portions of my investment portfolio for over a decade, and our relationship was built on his respect for my analytical approach to financial planning and my understanding of complex market dynamics. During our meeting, I mentioned that I might need documentation of my ongoing cognitive competence for legal purposes, and Kenneth immediately offered to provide written testimony about my mental acuity and decision-making capabilities. Kenneth's observations carried particular weight because financial advisors are trained to recognize signs of cognitive decline in elderly clients. They're required to report suspected diminished capacity to protect vulnerable adults from exploitation and poor financial decisions. The fact that Kenneth had been working with me regularly and had never expressed any concerns about my mental state would be powerful evidence against Ryan's amateur psychological assessment. I also scheduled an appointment with my primary care physician, Dr. Sarah Chen, who had been monitoring my health since my retirement 3 years ago. Dr. Chen was thorough, professional, and familiar with the kind of cognitive assessment tools used to evaluate mental competence in older adults. I explained the situation clearly and requested formal cognitive testing to establish baseline documentation of my current mental state. Dr. Chen was appropriately outraged by Ryan's public accusations and immediately agreed to conduct comprehensive cognitive assessments that would provide objective evidence of my mental capabilities. She scheduled me for a full battery of tests, including memory evaluation, executive function assessment, and screening for dementia or other cognitive disorders. The testing would take place over 2 appointments and would generate the kind of professional documentation that could counter any future challenges to my competence. While I was building my evidentiary foundation, I also began researching Ryan's background more thoroughly than I had ever bothered to do during his courtship of Amy. I had always taken my daughter's romantic choices at face value, assuming that her judgment about character and compatibility was sound. But Ryan's calculated attack on my reputation suggested a level of strategic thinking that warranted closer examination. Ryan worked for Meridian Pharmaceuticals as a regional sales representative, a position that required charm and persistence, but not necessarily integrity or expertise. His educational background included a bachelor's degree in business administration from a mid-tier state university and various sales training certifications that focused more on persuasion techniques than scientific knowledge. He had been with Meridian for 6 years, working his way up from entry-level sales to his current territory management role. What I found most interesting was Ryan's employment history before joining Meridian. He had worked for 3 different pharmaceutical companies in 5 years, moving from position to position with increasing frequency. Each transition had been described as a better opportunity or career advancement, but the pattern suggested someone who either couldn't maintain stable employment or who moved on when situations became uncomfortable. I also discovered that Ryan had been involved in a minor professional controversy at his previous company, something about misrepresenting product information to healthcare providers that had resulted in a formal reprimand and additional training requirements. The details were vague, buried in industry publications and professional forums, but they painted a picture of someone who was willing to bend facts to achieve his goals, even in professional settings where accuracy was crucial. Amy's financial situation became clearer through careful observation and discreet inquiries. Their mortgage payment on the Brookfield Heights house was substantial, even with my down payment contribution, and their lifestyle expenses seemed to exceed what Ryan's sales income could comfortably support. They leased expensive cars, took elaborate vacations, and spent money on home improvements and entertainment that suggested either excellent financial planning or mounting debt. I began to suspect that Ryan's attack on my competence might be motivated by more than just control issues or personality conflicts. If they were struggling financially, establishing me as mentally incompetent could potentially provide access to my assets through guardianship proceedings or other legal mechanisms. It was a disturbing possibility, but one that explained the systematic nature of his campaign and the timing of his public accusations. The more I learned about Ryan's background and behavior patterns, the more I understood that this wasn't about family dynamics or generational misunderstandings. This was about a man who saw my financial resources as a solution to his problems, and my independence as an obstacle to accessing those resources. He had been working to establish a narrative that would justify legal intervention in my affairs, positioning himself as the concerned family member protecting a declining relative from her own poor judgment. The realization crystallized my response strategy. This wasn't a family disagreement that could be resolved through better communication or emotional appeals. This was a calculated attack on my autonomy that required equally calculated defensive measures. I needed to not only document my ongoing competence, but also establish clear legal protections against future challenges to my mental state or financial decisions. I scheduled a meeting with James Morrison, my attorney, to discuss comprehensive estate planning updates that would include specific provisions for cognitive assessment and guardianship protection. James suggested creating detailed documentation of my current mental state, establishing clear procedures for any future competence evaluations, and updating my financial power of attorney documents to include safeguards against abuse. We also discussed the possibility of updating my will to include specific language about challenges to my mental competence, provisions that would make it more difficult for family members to contest my decisions based on claimed cognitive decline. James recommended adding what he called no contest clauses that would disinherit anyone who unsuccessfully challenged my mental state in court, creating financial disincentives for frivolous competence challenges. During our meeting, James mentioned that he had seen increasing numbers of elder abuse cases involving family members who attempted to gain control of aging relatives' assets by claiming mental incompetence. He described sophisticated schemes where family members would create evidence of cognitive decline, isolate elderly relatives from supportive relationships, and manipulate medical professionals into supporting guardianship proceedings. The pattern James described matched Ryan's behavior almost perfectly. The systematic undermining of my credibility, the public accusations designed to create witnesses to my supposed decline, the positioning of himself as the responsible family member dealing with a difficult situation. Ryan had been following a playbook, whether consciously or instinctively, that could have resulted in legal control over my assets and decisions if I hadn't recognized what was happening and responded appropriately. By early November, I had assembled a comprehensive portfolio of evidence documenting my ongoing mental competence, professional capabilities, and financial acumen. The portfolio included recent medical evaluations, cognitive test results, professional consultations, financial assessments, and legal documentation establishing clear protections against future challenges to my autonomy. Dr. Chen's cognitive assessments had produced results that placed me well within normal ranges for all measures of mental function, with several scores that exceeded average performance for adults in my age group. Her written report explicitly stated that I showed no signs of cognitive decline, dementia, or other mental impairments that would affect my ability to make sound personal or financial decisions. Dr. Rodriguez had provided a letter detailing our recent professional consultations and confirming my ongoing medical knowledge and clinical reasoning abilities. Kenneth Walsh had documented my sophisticated understanding of financial markets and investment strategies, noting that my portfolio, performance and decision-making demonstrated continued analytical capabilities and sound judgment. The documentation painted a picture of sustained competence that directly contradicted Ryan's claims about my mental decline. More importantly, it established a baseline that would make any future challenges to my cognitive abilities much more difficult to pursue. Anyone questioning my mental state would need to overcome substantial objective evidence of my capabilities, evidence that had been compiled by multiple professionals in direct response to Ryan's accusations. I also updated my estate planning documents to include explicit protections against competence challenges and clear procedures for any future cognitive assessments. The new document specified that any questions about my mental state would need to be evaluated by board-certified geriatricians using standardized assessment tools, and that family members making unfounded accusations of incompetence would face financial consequences through the updated will provisions. The legal framework I had established created significant barriers to the kind of attack Ryan had attempted. He would no longer be able to make casual accusations about my mental state without facing professional evaluation and potential financial penalties. More importantly, I had documented my current capabilities so thoroughly that any future claims of cognitive decline would need to overcome substantial evidence to the contrary. As November progressed, I began to feel a quiet satisfaction that had nothing to do with revenge or vindication. I had identified a serious threat to my autonomy and independence, analyzed the situation systematically, and implemented comprehensive protections that preserved my rights and dignity. The process had required the same analytical skills, attention to detail, and strategic thinking that had made me successful as a physician for 4 decades. Ryan had underestimated me in multiple ways. He had assumed that my age made me vulnerable to manipulation, that my retirement had diminished my capabilities, and that my family loyalty would prevent me from taking strong defensive measures. He had been wrong on all counts, and his miscalculations had resulted in a much stronger position for me than I had possessed before his attack. The portfolio of evidence I had assembled would protect me not just against Ryan's specific accusations, but against any future challenges to my competence. From any source, I had created a legal and medical foundation that would be extremely difficult to undermine. Documentation that established my capabilities in terms that courts and healthcare providers would understand and respect. More importantly, I had demonstrated to myself that my analytical abilities, professional connections, and strategic thinking remained as sharp as they had ever been. Ryan's attempt to portray me as a declining elderly woman had instead prompted me to document my ongoing strengths in ways that made my capabilities undeniable. The irony wasn't lost on me that Ryan's attack had actually strengthened my position rather than weakening it. His accusations had motivated me to create protections I might never have bothered to establish otherwise, defenses that would serve me well regardless of what challenges might arise in the future. Sometimes the most effective way to demonstrate your competence is to be forced to prove it comprehensively, and Ryan had provided exactly that motivation. By Thanksgiving, I had transformed his attack into armor, his accusations into advantages, and his attempt to diminish me into a demonstration of strength that would protect my independence for years to come. The quiet satisfaction I felt wasn't about defeating Ryan, but about preserving my autonomy through the same systematic approach that had guided my medical career. I had diagnosed the problem, developed a treatment plan, and implemented a solution that addressed not just the immediate threat, but the underlying vulnerabilities that had made the attack possible. The foundation was set, my documentation complete, my legal protections in place. But I sensed this was only the beginning. Ryan had shown me who he really was, and I had shown him that his assumptions about my vulnerability were dangerously inaccurate. The next phase would test whether he had learned from his miscalculation or whether his need for control would drive him to make even more serious errors in judgment. I was prepared for either possibility, armed with evidence, protected by law, and confident in capabilities that 45 years of medical practice had proven beyond any reasonable doubt. Thanksgiving arrived like a test I hadn't studied for, an invitation that came through Amy's carefully worded text message 3 days before the holiday. She wrote that they would love to have me join them for dinner, that it would be nice to spend time together as a family, and that Ryan was looking forward to seeing me. The phrasing was diplomatic enough to maintain plausible deniability, while carrying an undercurrent of obligation disguised as affection. I stared at the message for a long time, sitting in my kitchen with morning coffee growing cold in my hands. This wasn't really an invitation. It was a probe, a carefully orchestrated attempt to gauge whether my documentation and legal maneuvering had been defensive posturing or evidence of genuine strength. They wanted to see if I would return to my previous role as the accommodating family member who absorbed disrespect with grace, or if something fundamental had shifted in our dynamic. The smart move would have been to decline politely, to maintain distance while my new boundaries solidified. But I had spent 4 decades making difficult decisions under pressure, and I understood that sometimes you had to walk directly into uncomfortable situations to resolve them definitively. Avoiding this dinner would only postpone the inevitable confrontation and potentially signal weakness to Ryan, who was undoubtedly calculating his next move based on my response to his barbecue performance. I accepted the invitation with the same neutral tone Amy had used, confirming my attendance without expressing enthusiasm or reluctance. I would go, but not as the diminished elderly relative Ryan had attempted to portray. I would arrive armed, with confidence, protected by documentation, and prepared for whatever theatrical production they had planned for this family gathering. The days leading up to Thanksgiving gave me time to consider strategy and prepare mentally for what would likely be an exercise in careful psychological warfare. Ryan was too proud and too invested in his narrative about my declining competence to simply acknowledge his error and move forward gracefully. He would need to test my resolve, to probe for weaknesses in my new position, to find ways to reassert his authority over family dynamics. I spent Wednesday afternoon getting my hair styled at the salon where I had been a client for 15 years. Margaret, my stylist, commented on how vibrant I looked, how much energy I seemed to have compared to our last appointment. She asked if I had been traveling or trying new activities, something that was giving me such a confident appearance. I smiled and told her I had been working on some projects that were going very well, which was true in ways she couldn't have imagined. I chose my outfit with the same careful consideration I had once used when preparing for medical conferences, where I needed to establish credibility with colleagues who might question my expertise. Navy blue suit with a silk blouse, minimal jewelry, that suggested substance rather than ornamentation, and comfortable heels that would allow me to maintain dignified posture throughout whatever awkwardness awaited me. The drive to Brookfield Heights felt different this time. Not with the nervous anticipation of someone hoping for family acceptance, but with the steady confidence of someone who had prepared thoroughly for a necessary but unpleasant task. I was no longer going as a supplicant hoping for inclusion. I was going as an equal who demanded respect, armed with the documentation to enforce that demand if necessary. Their house looked exactly the same from the outside: impressive landscaping and architectural details that suggested success and stability. But I saw it differently now, understanding the financial pressures that lurked behind the aesthetic perfection, the mounting debt that made my assets an attractive target for someone desperate enough to attack my competence publicly. Amy answered, the door with a smile that seemed genuine but nervous, the kind of expression people wear when they're trying to gauge the mood of someone whose reaction they can't predict. She hugged me with appropriate warmth while scanning my face for signs of lingering anger or defensive posture. I returned her embrace naturally, neither cold nor effusive, maintaining the same neutral demeanor I had cultivated during my medical career when dealing with difficult families. Ryan emerged from the kitchen carrying a drink, and I watched his body language carefully as he approached. He had practiced this moment, rehearsed the right tone and expression to convey appropriate family affection while maintaining his authority as the concerned son-in-law who had everyone's best interests at heart. His smile was calculated, his greeting pitched to sound warm without acknowledging any impropriety in his previous behavior. The living room had been arranged to accommodate the three of us in a conversation cluster, chairs positioned to encourage intimate family discussion rather than formal dinner party interaction. I recognized the staging immediately, understanding that this was intended to be a reconciliation scene where we would address our misunderstanding and re-establish normal family relationships under Ryan's continued leadership. Amy offered me wine or coffee, and I requested water with lemon, maintaining the same healthy lifestyle choices that contradicted any narrative about cognitive decline or poor self-care. Ryan made small talk about the weather and holiday travel, neutral topics that allowed him to demonstrate his normal, reasonable demeanor while avoiding any reference to our recent conflict. The conversation continued in this carefully orchestrated manner for nearly an hour, with both Amy and Ryan performing their roles as loving family members who were pleased to have me join their holiday celebration. They asked about my activities, complimented my appearance, and shared mundane updates about their work and social lives. It was a masterclass in surface-level family interaction, designed to suggest that previous tensions had been resolved through maturity and mutual understanding. But I could feel the undercurrent of evaluation throughout every exchange. Ryan was studying my responses, looking for signs of confusion, memory lapses, or emotional instability that would support his claims about my mental decline. Amy was monitoring both of us, trying to gauge whether this dinner would end in renewed conflict, or successful peace negotiations. The dining room had been set with their best china and crystal, an impressive display that reinforced their success and sophistication, while subtly emphasizing the generosity they were showing by including me in such an elegant gathering. The meal itself was professionally catered, eliminating any possibility of domestic stress or imperfection that might disrupt their carefully crafted presentation. During dinner, Ryan began testing my memory and cognitive function with questions, disguised as normal conversation. He referenced events from months or years ago, watching carefully to see if I would recall details accurately or provide responses that suggested confusion or false memories. He mentioned medical developments in ways that would reveal whether I was keeping current with professional knowledge or relying on outdated information. I answered each question with the precision that had characterized my medical career, providing specific details, accurate timelines, and current information that demonstrated ongoing intellectual engagement. When he mentioned a new pharmaceutical treatment in his sales territory, I was able to discuss the clinical trials, side effect profiles, and comparative effectiveness data with an expertise that clearly surprised him. Amy watched these exchanges with growing awareness that Ryan's casual probing was revealing capabilities rather than deficiencies. My responses were not only accurate, but demonstrated knowledge and analytical thinking that contradicted every assumption about age-related cognitive decline. I wasn't struggling to keep up with their conversation. I was leading it, providing insights and perspectives that drew on decades of professional experience and ongoing intellectual curiosity. As the evening progressed, Ryan's frustration became increasingly visible despite his efforts to maintain pleasant family dynamics. His questions became more pointed, his challenges to my statements more direct, his attempts to position himself as the informed authority more obvious. He was losing control of the narrative he had worked so hard to establish, watching his carefully constructed assessment of my mental state crumble under the weight of evidence. The turning point came when Ryan made a casual reference to memory, issues that affect everyone as they get older, suggesting that it was natural and expected for people my age to experience cognitive difficulties. He spoke with the kind of patronizing authority that assumed everyone would agree with his assessment, that his expertise in pharmaceutical sales qualified him to make pronouncements about geriatric medicine. I set down my coffee cup carefully, looked directly at Ryan, and began discussing the neuroscience of aging with the clinical precision I had used when teaching medical students. I explained the difference between normal age-related changes and pathological cognitive decline, described the various types of dementia and their diagnostic criteria, and outlined the current research on cognitive preservation and enhancement in older adults. My presentation was thorough, accurate, and delivered with the confidence of someone who had spent decades working with elderly patients and understanding the complexities of aging. I referenced recent studies, cited statistical data, and demonstrated exactly the kind of intellectual capability that Ryan had been systematically undermining for months. Amy's expression shifted during my impromptu lecture, moving from nervous monitoring to obvious pride in her mother's expertise. She was remembering who I really was, not the diminished elderly relative Ryan had been portraying, but the accomplished physician who had built a respected career through knowledge and competence. Ryan's face had gone very still, the kind of frozen expression people wear when they realize they have made a serious miscalculation. He had challenged my cognitive abilities in front of a witness and received a response that not only demonstrated my mental acuity, but highlighted his own lack of qualifications to assess anyone's neurological function. The silence that followed. My presentation stretched uncomfortably, filled with the weight of Ryan's public humiliation and the collapse of his authority on matters related to my mental state. Amy looked back and forth between us, understanding finally that her husband's concerns about my cognitive decline had been either misguided or deliberately fabricated. I resumed eating my dessert as if nothing unusual had happened, allowing the implications of my demonstration to settle without commentary or emphasis. The evidence spoke for itself. Ryan's assessment of my mental capabilities had been exposed as uninformed opinion at best, deliberate manipulation at worst. Ryan attempted to recover by suggesting that professional knowledge didn't necessarily translate to personal self-awareness, that doctors often struggled to recognize their own symptoms. But his voice lacked conviction now, and his arguments sounded defensive rather than authoritative. He had lost credibility on the very topic where he had claimed special insight. Amy began asking me questions about my recent professional activities, my ongoing connections with former colleagues, and my current involvement in medical continuing education. Her interest seemed genuine, rather than evaluative, as if she were rediscovering aspects of my identity that had been obscured by Ryan's constant implications about my declining capabilities. I described my recent consultation with Dr. Rodriguez, my participation in the geriatric medicine conference, and my ongoing review of current medical literature. Each detail reinforced the picture of sustained professional engagement and intellectual vitality that contradicted every element of Ryan's narrative about my mental state. The evening ended with polite expressions of gratitude and tentative plans for future gatherings, but the fundamental dynamic had shifted irreversibly. Ryan could no longer position himself as the family authority on my cognitive abilities. Amy had witnessed evidence of my ongoing competence that made her husband's previous claims appear either incompetent or malicious. As I drove home through the quiet streets of Riverside, I reflected on the strategic success of the evening. I had walked directly into Ryan's territory, faced his challenges on ground of his choosing, and emerged with enhanced credibility rather than diminished standing. He had attempted to test my mental acuity and received a demonstration of capabilities that exceeded his own knowledge in relevant areas. More importantly, Amy had observed the entire exchange and drawn her own conclusions about the reliability of Ryan's assessments. She had seen evidence that her mother's intellectual capabilities remained formidable, that her husband's concerns about cognitive decline were unsupported by actual observation, and that the family dynamics she had accepted were based on false premises. The documentation I had assembled over the previous months had provided confidence and legal protection, but this evening had accomplished something equally important. It had re-established my credibility through direct demonstration, rather than written evidence. Ryan could no longer make casual comments about my mental state without risking immediate contradiction from someone who had superior knowledge and professional credentials. The Thanksgiving dinner had become an examination that Ryan had failed, spectacularly, exposing his lack of qualifications to assess anyone's cognitive abilities, while demonstrating my continued intellectual sharpness. He had created a test designed to reveal my weaknesses, and instead revealed his own limitations. As I prepared for bed that night, I felt the quiet satisfaction of someone who had faced a challenge directly and emerged stronger. Ryan's campaign against my competence had not only failed but had backfired, creating opportunities for me to demonstrate capabilities he had been systematically undermining. His attempt to diminish me had instead provided a platform for showcasing exactly why his assessment had been so thoroughly wrong. The evening had established new parameters for our relationship, boundaries based on demonstrated competence rather than assumed authority. Ryan would need to find different strategies if he wanted to continue pursuing access to my assets, because his approach through cognitive undermining had been definitively discredited in front of the one family member, whose opinion mattered most. I had turned his own weapon against him, using his challenge as an opportunity to prove exactly the opposite of what he had intended to demonstrate. Sometimes the most effective response to an attack is not defense, but overwhelming evidence that the attack itself was based on fundamental misunderstanding of your actual capabilities. December brought with it the kind of sharp clarity that comes after a decisive victory, but I knew better than to assume Ryan would simply accept defeat and retreat gracefully. Men like him, who build their identity around control and authority, rarely abandon their objectives when initial strategies fail. They adapt, evolve their tactics, and search for alternative approaches to achieve the same goals. I had won the Thanksgiving battle decisively, but the war for my autonomy and assets was far from over. The first sign of Ryan's new strategy emerged in early December through a seemingly innocent phone call from Amy. She mentioned, almost casually, that Ryan had been discussing my living situation with some colleagues in the healthcare industry. According to Amy, these conversations had generated suggestions about supportive living environments and communities designed for active seniors that might provide better social connections and safety features than my current house. I listened carefully to Amy's description of these conversations, noting the language being used and the assumptions underlying the recommendations. Ryan was shifting his approach from direct attacks on my cognitive abilities to concerns about my physical safety and social isolation. Instead of portraying me as mentally incompetent, he was now suggesting that I was vulnerable due to age-related physical limitations and the inherent dangers of living alone. This new strategy was actually more sophisticated than his previous, crude assault on my mental state. Physical frailty and social isolation were legitimate concerns for elderly individuals, and recommendations for supportive living arrangements could sound reasonable and compassionate rather than manipulative and self-serving. Ryan was positioning himself as the caring family member who recognized risks that I was too proud or stubborn to acknowledge myself. The genius of this approach was that it didn't require proving cognitive impairment, which had proven impossible, given my documented mental acuity. Instead, it relied on general assumptions about aging and safety that many people would find plausible without requiring specific evidence. Even competent elderly individuals could benefit from supportive environments, and resistance to such suggestions could be characterized as dangerous independence rather than rational decision-making. I recognized immediately that this strategy posed a more serious threat than Ryan's amateur psychological assessments. Physical safety concerns could justify interventions that cognitive challenges alone could not, and the legal standards for demonstrating unsafe living conditions were often less stringent than those required for proving mental incompetence. Ryan was learning from his mistakes and adapting his tactics accordingly. My response needed to be equally strategic and preemptive. I couldn't simply rely on documentation of mental competence to counter concerns about physical safety and social isolation. I needed to demonstrate ongoing physical capability, social engagement, and environmental security that would make any claims about unsafe living conditions appear unfounded and potentially malicious. I began by scheduling comprehensive physical and occupational therapy evaluations that would document my current functional abilities and identify any areas where preventive interventions might be beneficial. Dr. Chen referred me to specialists who could assess my balance, strength, mobility, and overall physical capacity using standardized tests that would provide objective measures of my capabilities. The physical therapy evaluation took place at Riverside Rehabilitation Center, where I had occasionally referred patients during my medical career. The therapist, Linda Morrison, was thorough and professional, conducting tests that measured everything, from grip strength and reaction time to complex motor coordination and endurance. The results placed me well within normal ranges for my age group, with several scores that exceeded average performance for women in their 60s. Linda's written report documented not only my current physical capabilities, but also provided recommendations for maintaining and improving my functional status through targeted exercise and safety modifications. Her assessment would serve as powerful evidence against any claims that I was physically unable to manage independent living safely and effectively. I also arranged for a comprehensive home safety evaluation through a certified aging-in-place specialist recommended by my insurance company. The evaluator, Thomas Bradley, was an occupational therapist with expertise in environmental modifications for older adults. He spent 3 hours examining every aspect of my house, from lighting and flooring to bathroom safety and emergency preparedness. Thomas's evaluation revealed minor recommendations for improving safety and accessibility, modifications that I implemented immediately to eliminate any potential criticisms of my living environment. I installed additional lighting in hallways and stairwells, added grab bars in strategic bathroom locations, and upgraded my home security system to include medical alert capabilities. These modifications served dual purposes. They genuinely improved the safety and functionality of my living space, which was beneficial regardless of any family conflicts. More importantly, they demonstrated proactive attention to age-related safety considerations, making it difficult for anyone to claim that I was neglecting reasonable precautions or refusing to acknowledge legitimate concerns about independent living. I also began expanding my social engagement in ways that would create visible evidence of my community connections and support network. I volunteered at the Riverside Medical Center's patient advocacy program, where my professional background made me particularly effective at helping patients navigate complex healthcare decisions and insurance issues. The volunteer work provided multiple benefits beyond simply countering isolation concerns. It kept me current with medical practice changes and healthcare policy developments, maintained my connection to the professional community where my expertise was valued, and created a network of colleagues who could testify to my ongoing competence and engagement if necessary. I joined a book club at the local library that focused on contemporary fiction and nonfiction, ensuring regular social interaction with peers who shared intellectual interests. The group met weekly and often extended discussions to coffee shops or restaurant gatherings, creating multiple witnesses to my social skills and cognitive engagement. Additionally, I enrolled in a continuing education program at the community college, taking courses in digital photography and art history that challenged me to learn new skills while demonstrating intellectual curiosity and adaptability. These activities created a documented pattern of ongoing learning and social participation that contradicted any narrative about declining engagement or isolation. My financial advisor, Kenneth, and I also developed a more sophisticated investment strategy that required active management and regular decision-making, creating additional documentation of my ongoing analytical capabilities and sound judgment. Kenneth began sending me detailed quarterly reports that required my review and approval for portfolio adjustments, establishing a paper trail of complex financial decisions being made competently and independently. By mid-December, I had assembled compelling evidence of physical capability, social engagement, environmental safety, and financial acumen that would be extremely difficult for Ryan to challenge credibly. More importantly, I had created a lifestyle that was genuinely fulfilling and stimulating, proving to myself that aging didn't require accepting diminished expectations or reduced autonomy. The effectiveness of my defensive preparations became apparent when Amy mentioned another conversation with Ryan about my living situation. This time, his concerns seemed less certain, his recommendations more tentative. When Amy had shared information about my volunteer work, educational activities, and home improvements, Ryan's response had been notably subdued compared to his previous confident pronouncements about my needs and limitations. I decided it was time to take a more proactive approach rather than simply responding to Ryan's evolving strategies. I invited Amy to have lunch with me, just the two of us, at a restaurant where we could have a private conversation without Ryan's influence or presence. I wanted to understand how much Amy was genuinely concerned about my welfare versus how much she was simply relaying Ryan's opinions and suggestions. The lunch meeting took place at Carrington's, an upscale restaurant downtown where I had occasionally entertained colleagues during my medical career. I chose the location deliberately to reinforce my competence and social sophistication while providing a comfortable environment for serious conversation. Amy arrived looking slightly nervous, as if she weren't sure what to expect from this mother-daughter discussion. I began the conversation by asking directly about her own observations of my capabilities and lifestyle, encouraging her to share any genuine concerns she might have about my health, safety, or well-being. Amy seemed relieved to be asked for her honest assessment rather than being positioned as a messenger for someone else's opinions. Her responses revealed that she had very few independent concerns about my situation. She acknowledged that I seemed healthy, engaged, and capable of managing my affairs effectively. Most of the concerns she had mentioned in previous conversations were actually Ryan's observations and suggestions, rather than her own worries about my welfare. I then shared with Amy the comprehensive documentation I had assembled over the past months, showing her the medical evaluations, cognitive assessments, physical therapy reports, and home safety improvements. I explained how these documents provided objective evidence of my ongoing capabilities and proactive attention to age-related considerations. Amy's reaction was telling. She seemed genuinely impressed by the thoroughness of my preparations and somewhat embarrassed that she had been relaying concerns that were contradicted by such extensive evidence. She began to understand that Ryan's suggestions about my living situation were based on assumptions rather than actual observation or professional assessment. I carefully explained to Amy the difference between legitimate safety planning and premature intervention, helping her understand that proactive preparations were different from reactive responses to demonstrated problems. I showed her how my volunteer work, educational activities, and social engagement provided exactly the kinds of stimulation and support that healthcare professionals recommended for successful aging. Most importantly, I helped Amy understand that decisions about my living situation should be based on my own assessment of my needs and preferences, informed by professional evaluations and objective evidence rather than other people's assumptions about what might be appropriate for someone my age. Amy left our lunch meeting with a much clearer understanding of my actual situation and capabilities, armed with information that would allow her to respond more thoughtfully to Ryan's future suggestions about my living arrangements. She seemed relieved to discover that her mother was not only competent, but actively engaged in maintaining and improving her independence through evidence-based planning. That evening, Amy called to thank me for the lunch and the documentation I had shared. She mentioned that she felt much more confident about my situation and would be better able to address any future concerns that might arise. Her tone suggested that she had gained new respect for my proactive approach to aging and my refusal to accept limitations that weren't supported by actual evidence. The conversation with Amy marked a turning point in my relationship with both her and Ryan. Amy now had independent knowledge of my capabilities and preparations, making her less susceptible to Ryan's attempts to influence her perception of my situation. She had moved from being his messenger to being an informed observer who could evaluate his suggestions based on actual evidence rather than assumption. More importantly, Amy's new understanding of my situation created an additional layer of protection against Ryan's evolving strategies. She could no longer be used as an unwitting ally in campaigns against my independence, and she might even become an advocate for my autonomy if Ryan continued pursuing inappropriate interventions. Ryan's response to this shift became apparent within days of my lunch with Amy. He began making more direct approaches, calling me personally to discuss his concerns about my living situation rather than working through Amy as an intermediary. His tone was superficially respectful and caring, but his persistence revealed frustration with his inability to gain traction for his recommendations through normal family channels. During these conversations, Ryan attempted to position himself as uniquely qualified to assess my needs due to his work in the pharmaceutical industry and his exposure to healthcare professionals. He referenced conversations with colleagues about aging and safety, suggesting that professional expertise supported his concerns about my current living arrangements. I listened to these presentations politely, but responded with specific questions about the credentials and expertise of the people Ryan was citing. When pressed for details about their qualifications or the specific basis for their recommendations, Ryan's responses became vague and defensive. It became clear that his professional consultations were actually casual conversations with sales colleagues who had no particular expertise in geriatric care or aging-in-place assessment. I began sharing with Ryan the same documentation I had shown Amy, providing him with objective evidence that contradicted his assumptions about my capabilities and safety needs. I described my volunteer work, educational activities, and social engagement, demonstrating the kind of active lifestyle that healthcare professionals actually recommended for successful aging. Ryan's reaction to this evidence was notably different from Amy's response. Where Amy had seemed genuinely pleased to learn about my proactive preparations, Ryan appeared frustrated and dismissive. He questioned the relevance of my activities, suggested that I might be overexerting myself, and implied that my busy schedule actually supported his concerns about my judgment and decision-making. His responses revealed that Ryan's campaign was not actually motivated by genuine concern for my welfare, but by some other agenda that my demonstrated competence and independence threatened. He was not relieved to discover that I was safe and capable. He was disappointed that his concerns had been proven unfounded. This realization crystallized my understanding of Ryan's true motivations and confirmed my suspicions about his long-term objectives. He was not trying to help me make better decisions about my living situation. He was trying to establish grounds for intervention that would give him influence over my decisions and potentially access to my assets. The pattern was becoming clear. Ryan had systematically attacked my cognitive abilities, been defeated by overwhelming evidence of my mental competence, and then shifted to concerns about physical safety and social isolation. When these concerns were also contradicted by objective evidence, he didn't express relief or satisfaction. He expressed frustration and searched for new approaches to achieve the same goal of undermining my independence. I realized that Ryan would continue evolving his strategies until he either succeeded in gaining control over my affairs or concluded that the effort was too costly and risky to continue. My defensive preparations had been successful so far, but I needed to shift from reactive defense to proactive deterrence if I wanted to end his campaign permanently. The time had come to demonstrate not just my capability to defend against his attacks, but my willingness and ability to take offensive action if his inappropriate interventions continued. Ryan needed to understand that challenging my autonomy carried consequences that extended beyond simply being proven wrong. I had spent months building armor. Now it was time to forge a sword. The opportunity presented itself in January when Ryan made his most audacious move yet. He contacted my attorney James Morrison directly, claiming to represent my family's concerns about my decision-making capacity and requesting information about my estate planning documents. He positioned himself as a responsible relative seeking to ensure my affairs were properly managed, suggesting that recent changes in my behavior warranted professional review of my legal and financial arrangements. James called me immediately. After receiving Ryan's inquiry, his voice carrying the kind of controlled outrage that comes from decades of dealing with predatory family members. He explained that Ryan had presented himself as my concerned son-in-law, who had observed troubling signs of cognitive decline and wanted to discuss options for protecting my interests. Ryan had specifically asked about power of attorney documents, trust arrangements, and the procedures for challenging estate planning decisions if competency became an issue. The audacity was breathtaking. Ryan had moved from subtle manipulation to direct legal inquiry, essentially conducting reconnaissance for a potential guardianship proceeding or competency challenge. He was gathering intelligence about my legal protections while positioning himself as the family representative authorized to make such inquiries on my behalf. James had handled the call professionally, explaining that he could not discuss client information without explicit authorization and suggesting that any concerns about my competency should be addressed through proper medical and legal channels rather than informal family consultations. But Ryan's approach had revealed the scope of his ambitions and the sophistication of his planning. I realized that Ryan had been building toward this moment for months, possibly years. His systematic undermining of my credibility, his public accusations about my mental state, his evolving concerns about my safety and independence had all been preparation for formal legal action. He had been creating a narrative that would support a competency challenge while positioning himself as the reluctant but responsible family member forced to intervene for my protection. The time for defensive measures had passed. Ryan had escalated, beyond family dynamics into legal territory, and my response needed to match the seriousness of his threat. I instructed James to prepare what he called a nuclear option, a comprehensive legal strategy that would not only protect my interests, but expose Ryan's motives and potentially subject him to serious consequences for his inappropriate actions. James suggested filing a preemptive petition for protective orders against harassment and financial exploitation, supported by the extensive documentation I had assembled over the past months. We would present evidence of Ryan's systematic campaign against my autonomy, his unfounded accusations about my competency, and his attempts to access confidential legal information without authorization. More importantly, James recommended that we include in our filing a detailed financial analysis of Ryan and Amy's situation, information that would reveal potential motives for his behavior. James had connections with investigators who specialized in family financial exploitation cases, professionals who could document the financial pressures that might drive someone to pursue inappropriate access to an elderly relative's assets. The investigation revealed exactly what I had suspected. Ryan and Amy were drowning in debt despite their affluent lifestyle, carrying credit card balances that exceeded their annual income, facing potential foreclosure on their mortgage, and struggling with loan payments on their expensive cars and home improvements. Their financial situation was deteriorating rapidly, and my substantial assets represented their only potential source of relief. More damaging was the discovery that Ryan had been researching guardianship procedures and elder law attorneys, activities that predated his expressions of concern about my well-being by several months. He had been planning legal action against my autonomy while still maintaining a facade of family concern, gathering information about how to challenge my competency before he had even established grounds for such concerns. Armed with this evidence, James filed a comprehensive petition that painted a devastating picture of Ryan's motivations and methods. The document detailed his systematic campaign against my reputation, his unfounded accusations about my mental state, his inappropriate contact with my attorney, and his financial motives for seeking control over my affairs. The petition requested protective orders that would prevent Ryan from making any further inquiries about my legal or financial affairs, from discussing my competency with third parties, and from attempting to influence medical or legal professionals regarding my care or decision-making capacity. We also requested that any future challenges to my competency be subject to heightened scrutiny, given the evidence of harassment and potential financial exploitation. Most devastatingly, our filing included a detailed accounting of my contribution to Ryan and Amy's down payment, information that had been carefully documented but never previously disclosed to extended family or community members. The court documents would become public record, exposing Ryan's hypocrisy in attacking the competency of someone whose financial generosity had made his lifestyle possible. Ryan's reaction to the legal filing was swift and panicked. Within days of being served with court papers, he attempted to contact me directly, then through Amy, and finally through James himself, seeking some way to resolve the matter without the public exposure and legal consequences that formal proceedings would bring. But I had moved beyond the possibility of private resolution. Ryan had crossed too many lines, escalated too far beyond family disagreement into potential legal action against my autonomy. His campaign had revealed intentions that were fundamentally incompatible with my safety and independence, motivations that would likely resurface in different forms, if not definitively addressed through legal channels. Amy found herself in an impossible position, torn between loyalty to her husband and growing awareness of his inappropriate behavior toward her mother. The evidence presented in court documents was overwhelming and undeniable, painting a picture of systematic manipulation that she could no longer rationalize or excuse. During a tearful phone conversation, Amy admitted that she had been blind to Ryan's true motivations, that she had accepted his characterizations of my situation without conducting her own independent evaluation. She expressed regret for relaying his concerns without verification and acknowledged that she should have recognized the inconsistency between his claims and her own observations of my capabilities. The court proceedings moved quickly once Ryan's pattern of behavior was fully documented. The judge granted protective orders that effectively ended Ryan's campaign against my autonomy, while establishing legal precedents that would make any future challenges extremely difficult to pursue successfully. More importantly, the public nature of the proceedings exposed Ryan's motivations and methods to the broader community, destroying his credibility as a concerned family member and revealing him as someone who had attempted to exploit an elderly relative for financial gain. Ryan's professional reputation suffered significant damage when his employer learned about the court proceedings and the evidence of his systematic harassment of a family member. Pharmaceutical companies are sensitive to ethical concerns, particularly when employees engage in behavior that could reflect poorly on corporate integrity and trustworthiness. Within months, Ryan and Amy were forced to sell their house and relocate to more modest accommodations. Their financial situation no longer sustainable without the access to my assets that Ryan had been planning to secure through legal manipulation. The lifestyle they had built on borrowed money and anticipated inheritance collapsed when their primary strategy for debt relief was definitively blocked. Amy and I gradually rebuilt our relationship on more honest foundations, though it took time for trust to be fully restored. She had learned valuable lessons about the importance of independent judgment and the dangers of allowing others to interpret reality on her behalf, even when those others were close family members. I emerged from the conflict stronger and more confident than I had been in years, my autonomy legally protected, and my capabilities publicly vindicated. The documentation I had assembled served not only as defense against Ryan's attacks, but as a roadmap for maintaining independence and competence throughout the aging process. My volunteer work expanded into consulting roles where my medical expertise and experience with elder advocacy provided valuable insights for healthcare organizations and legal professionals. I found purpose in helping other elderly individuals recognize and defend against similar exploitation attempts, sharing strategies for maintaining autonomy in the face of family pressure and societal assumptions about aging. The house on Maple Street became a symbol of successful aging in place, equipped with thoughtful safety modifications but fundamentally unchanged in its role as my independent home. I had proven that competent elderly individuals could maintain autonomy through preparation, documentation, and willingness to defend their rights when necessary. Ryan had taught me an invaluable lesson about the importance of vigilance and proactive protection, though not in the way he had intended. His attacks had forced me to document and strengthen my capabilities, to build legal protections I might never have bothered to establish, and to create support networks that enhanced both my safety and my independence. Sometimes the greatest gift an enemy can give you is the motivation to become stronger than you ever imagined possible. Ryan had tried to diminish me, and instead had prompted me to prove my strength so conclusively that it could never again be questioned by anyone with malicious intent. I had written my own ending to his story, one where experience triumphed over manipulation, where preparation defeated assumption, and where quiet strength proved more powerful than loud accusations. The woman who had been dismissed as losing her mind had demonstrated exactly why underestimating elderly competence was such a dangerous mistake. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.